Get started. So welcome everyone to the Forest Stewardship follow-up workshop. Tonight's session is about assessing post-fire tree mortality and what to do about it. We've got some guest speakers tonight, and I will let them introduce themselves before before each of their particular parts. And then once we're done, I do have an evaluation at the end, and I will share out the recording. So I'd like to start with Danny Cluck, who I will say is an entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service. But other than that, Danny, I'll let you share a little bit more about yourself and your presentation.
All right, thank you. Go ahead and share. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Danny Cluck, and I am an entomologist with U.S. Forest Service. I work out of the Lassen National Forest, but I serve all of Northeastern California, the Modoc, Lassen, Plumas, Tahoe, Lake Tahoe Basin, and also Lassen Volcanic National Park. And I've been in the Forest Service for quite some time, not always in forest health, but I started in forest health in 2000 and immediately got into looking at fire injured trees in 2000, probably 2001, really getting into it. And the reason is people would see fire injured trees. They see a lot of insect activity post fire. So usually the entomologists get called out to look at the trees. And what we would see is a lot of fire injured trees, stressed trees, damaged trees that were, very vulnerable to other stressors, drought and insects and so forth. And you always get asked the question, is this tree going to live or is this tree going to die? And at the time, there was a little bit of information out there, but not a whole lot. And so we joined forces with Rocky Mountain Research Station and decided to do a study for California looking at post-fire tree injury and probability of mortality based on those injuries. And I will share that study with you tonight. And that's really led into the marking guidelines that we have been using in the Forest Service now for a good 15 years for most of our post-fire projects. And it's the ones, they've been available for people to access on the public too. I don't know how widespread they've been used beyond the Forest Service, but those have been made available to you tonight, as well as a CAL FIRE version of them that's kind of a condensed version, a little more easy to read. And I think that's being shared with you tonight as well. So let's move on. So during the fire, lately, we got just a ton of heat out there, different forms. We have convection with those heat plumes moving through the canopy, causing injury to the foliage. We have radiation when trees combust and get consumed, often throws radiative heat to adjacent trees, can cause some damage there. We also have conduction. We have lots of conditions out there with heavy fuel loads on the ground, so that heat burning and smoldering on the ground can penetrate soils, and it also can burn around the base and up the boles of trees. And so after the fire, you obviously have a variety of injuries out there. You can have complete consumption of trees, and then also you have trees that the fire didn't ignite them, but the heat was intense enough or of such duration that it essentially killed the entire crown, and that's what we would call a tree that has been scorched. So the browning of the needles, but they weren't consumed. And for trees like, and we'll get into this, long needle pines, you can have this crown scorching through the entire crown or portions of the crown, but you might have bud survival. And so for our ponderosas and our Jeffreys, we can see those crowns all brown, but then the following growing season, you will see green shoots popping out where the buds survived. That the conduction that's going on in the ground, it can penetrate in the soil and cause root injury. We don't have a really good way, or really any way, of assessing that for the most part. So that's a big unknown of what types of heating causes what types of injuries to what types of trees. We do know a little bit about the types of injuries that heating causes around the base of the trees, where we can access the root collar, and then on the lower boles of trees. So the fire effects, there's the direct, immediate killing, lethal damage, consumption of tissues. Not much to talk about there. Those are pretty much no-brainers as far as identifying those in the field. But then there's the indirect effects of fire. So it leads to this delayed mortality, and that's where it gets, we have a lot of unknowns, and we use what we can, the evidence that we can, to try to come up with a reasonable prediction of whether a tree will live or die based on its fire injuries. And these delayed mortality, the injuries that lead to delayed mortality, if you can put a tree in a vacuum or a screen over it and keep out other things like insects, a lot of these trees might ultimately die. But when insects are allowed to move around and select these injured trees and attack them, then you usually end up this delayed mortality. It's a combination of factors. It could be predisposed trees that already had disease, like root disease. They could have been drought-stressed trees, which that's the case for the last couple of years. And then trees that were just injured so severely, they become highly attractive to bark and wood-boring beetles. And then, the reason a tree would potentially have delayed mortality without the aid of these other factors is just the inability to photosynthesize, because it's lost so much crown. You can have damage to the roots, infecting the ability of the tree to draw water from the soil. And then you have damage to the stem, which can actually penetrate the xylem. It can distort the cells, the water conducting cells of the xylem, and make them less efficient in moving water up into the tree. And then there's been some research done on the effects of the extreme bowl heating causing damage to the phloem layer. And when new wood is laid down in that zone, sometimes the xylem cells are still not as efficient as they could be. They kind of grow a little bit distorted in their shape and aren't able to move water as efficiently. And then another interesting thing is there's a potential for extreme heating of these heat plumes that are created with these massive fires, creating extreme heating above and around the canopies of trees that creates this strong vapor pressure deficit, which really causes so much water tension in the tree that it can cause cavitation of the xylem. And some of that damage can be very long-term and really inhibit the tree to move water long after the fire has passed. And so if you have a tree that was already drought stressed and you have these kind of heating injuries on top of it, it can really lead to a lot of post-fire mortality. So here's obviously a stand that's a no-brainer, absolutely nuked, consumed. I've seen a lot of this on the Dixie Fire, Sheep Fire. Don't really need to talk about those much. They are dead and they are not coming back. But then you get into a lot of areas that look like this. So this is Jeffrey Pine stand. This was the Beckworth complex. So this is one of those areas where it appears we had fire on the ground here, but I think there was a lot of convective heat in the canopy. And so these trees were just completely scorched top to bottom. This was taken not long after the fire. So it's really unclear if there was any bud survival in these crowns. But even if there was, trees that are scorched 100% have a much lower probability of survival than a tree that has some remaining green in it. So you can see some of these trees actually flush out the following spring with some new growth, but they often die shortly after as we move into the summer. And occasionally one will pull through. And this is what you would be looking for that following growing season, is those surviving buds in the scorched portion of the crown.
Danny, I hate to interrupt you, but your audio is coming in and out a little bit. You might want to just turn your camera off.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
If I can find it. How's that?
Sounds good for now.
Okay. So here's an example of some other scorched pines. I took a picture of these. All three of these had surviving buds in the upper portions of the crown after this was on the sheep fire. The two on the right didn't have any green after the fire. The one on the left actually has a little bit of a green top. And you can see, if you look at the crowns closely, you'll see that the crowns are relatively thin or thinner towards the top, as far as they're not retaining as many needles towards the top. And sometimes that's a really good indicator of the living portion of the crown where those buds actually survived. Because if the buds survived, those branches survived, and the needles were scorched, the tree has the ability to form an abscission layer, and the needles can be cast from that tree. But if that portion of the crown is really dead, then the needles tend to remain on the tree for a long time. And so it's not always consistent, but it is something to look at. And all three of these trees show that needle cast that represents a still living portion of the crown. I don't expect any of these trees to have a better than 50-50 chance. The two on the right are most likely going to die. The one on the left, more likely than not. But having that green, that remaining green after the fire, still allows this tree to move some water and to have photosynthesis and feed itself. So it's not trying to deplete its own carbon reserves like these other ones that can't photosynthesize at all. And a general rule of thumb, if a tree is injured, if the crown is burned less than 50% of the original crown length or volume, most likely that tree has a really good chance of survival, unless there was some injury around the base that we haven't accounted for yet. But if you're looking at trees with only half the crown burned, good chance of survival. When you get greater than 50% scorch or kill, then you really start seeing the probability of mortality go way up. Now for other tree species, here's a mixed conifer stand. We got some white fir over here. We got some incense cedar, a big sugar pine in the middle. These trees, pretty much what you see that gets scorched after the fire, there isn't any bud survival. And so whatever you see brown in the crown is dead, and there will not be green coming back, except in the, it's not common, and it doesn't really contribute a lot to the crown, but Douglas fir and white fir both seem to show the ability to have epicormic branching after the fire. The white fir can put out new stems off the bole, and Doug fir will have new little shoots off the branches. The ones I've seen, it doesn't seem to contribute a lot to the crown, and it didn't seem to help trees that were really severely burned and lost a lot of their crown initially in the fire during our study. But before we get into looking and talking about percentages of crown kill and cambium damage, right after the fire, you won't have much to look at other than those things. But as time goes by, within a month, sometimes, definitely by the next growing season, you will start seeing other indicators of damage to trees. And this is the things that are taking advantage of these injured trees, which are the bark and wood boring beetles. And so when we have people go take a look at trees, if we're out there, a month or two after the fire, or definitely the next year, we don't recommend spending a lot of time looking at the crowns or the cambium injury. You can simply walk up to the tree and look for these other indicators, such as pink or reddish pitch tubes from bark beetles, and pouch fungus conchs, where beetles have entered and exited the tree and allowed spores of the cryptoporous fungus to invade the tree. You can also see where woodpeckers are feeding on the wood-boring beetle larvae and the bark beetle larvae. They're excavating holes in the trees. And then some other areas where beetles are just pushing out boring dust and frass. And so all of these indicators show that there's a lot of insect activity in the tree. And if these indicators cover over at least 1/3 of the bole circumference, we pretty much call those trees goners, and there's no need to really spend any time looking at the crown damage or the cambium damage. And just an example of what I'm talking about. So the upper left, we have wood boring beetles. These long pieces of wood fibers are what the beetles were chewing out of the xylem of the tree. And then the brown is the frass or the beetle poop. And so they'll often push that out of the holes on that out to the exterior of the tree, and that stuff will collect in the crevices of the bark and all over the ground. You also have just really fine boring dust, and this is usually ambrosia beetles that are boring into the xylem in areas where the fire killed the cambium. And then bark beetle attacks, these are the pitch tubes, and the more red they are, the more likely the beetles have successfully gotten into the phloem layer and are mining tunnels and laying eggs. And then over here on the right, some of our larger wood-boring beetles, they chew out these egg niches. So they'll basically chew a circle down into the edge of the phloem layer underneath the bark and deposit eggs in those areas. And so that's another indicator you can use to represent significant beetle activity in a fire-injured tree. This tree on the left it's a Doug fir with pitch streamer. This is not a fire-injured tree, but I didn't have a good picture of pitch streamer, so I threw this in here. You will see this right after the fire in a lot of stands, especially on pines, where the heating of the bowl was so intense that it actually caused resin to burst out of the bark. And that usually happens in the thinner furrows of the bark, or it might extrude out of old branch tops. And a lot of people want to call this an indicator for bark beetle activity or wood boring beetle activity, but generally right after the fire, I tell people to not use this. So I just wanted to show you this is something I wouldn't consider evidence of significant bark or wood boring beetle activity, except in maybe later on in a special situation with some Douglas fir. The pouch fungus conchs is the picture in the middle, and these usually show up about a year after the tree dies or a portion of the tree dies, a section of the bowl that was severely burned. These will show up. And then of course, woodpeckers feeding picture the lower left. So let's get into the study that we did and talk about some numbers here. So we've conducted this study 2002, I think, when we started. We selected over close to 8,000 trees. And our objectives were to try to develop these post-fire mortality models based on fire injury, and then figure out what variables was the crown or the cambium or insect activity, what was the most important variable in predicting tree mortality. We wanted to compare some different crown injury types of measurements like crown length versus volume, and use our data to compare with other models out there. So we had white fir in our samples, incense cedar, sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, and ponderosa pine. We only looked at trees greater than 10 inches in diameter. We looked at crown length, volume. We looked at kill versus scorch for the ponderosas and the Jeffrey pines. So the scorch is where the buds survived, and kill is where buds and needles are both dead. We sampled cambium around the base of the tree, four areas in the cardinal directions. And we came up with a cambium kill rating of 0 to 4. So I'll talk about more about that later as far as what that means, the cambium kill rating. And then just presence or absence of bark beetle attacks, specifically red turpentine beetle attacks on ponderosa or Jeffrey pine is what we looked at. And so after we took the initial measurements on these trees after the fire, we followed them annually to document mortality. And at the end of 5 years, we were able to run the numbers based on the survivors and the ones that perished in 5 years and compare their fire injuries. And so it spit out what we kind of figured was crown injury is by far the most important variable when predicting tree mortality. If a tree does not have green needles, it's not likely to survive. The other variables we looked at were very much secondary, but they were significant, and that was the amount of cambium injury around the base of the tree, the presence or absence of red turpentine beetle on pines, and then for white fir and for larger diameter ponderosa and Jeffrey pine, we found a significance in tree diameter. And I'll talk about that in a bit too. This is how we looked at crowns, and this is how we continue to look at crowns when we use our marking guidelines in the field now. We look at a tree and we try to estimate the original pre-fire crown length. And so that's the entire crown length from the crown base height to the top of the tree. And then trees hardly ever are scorched in a perfect line across the crown, so usually have some diagonal. So we try to figure out the line of best fit that separates the fire scorched or killed area from the unburned area. And with that, you come up with your percent crown length scorched killed. And then putting this to work in the field, one of the most important things, and it's the first thing you need to do when assessing crown, is you got to come up with an accurate pre-fire crown base. And we do that by looking and trying to figure out what part of that crown, looking at the tree on the left here, was alive prior to the fire. And what we use to figure that out is the presence or absence of fine branching. So if you see really fine twigs and branches coming off the main branches, that was likely alive before the fire, and the needles have simply burned off or have fallen off after they were scorched. And then the portion below where you have branches, but you don't have any fine branching, that area was likely dead before the fire. And then we also play the game with you always have an uneven crown at the base of the tree. And so you're kind of moving branches around to help you estimate that pre-fire crown base, so you can come up with an accurate scorch or kill versus green percentage. And then Kim had sent us, someone had asked a question. I put it here as a reminder for him. So how does one distinguish pre-fire snags from post-fire mortality when both are burned? Well, that fine branching can be one thing. The longer a tree was dead before the fire, the more likely that it will either get consumed during the fire or actually have burning into the wood on the trunk of the tree. It'll become like kind of a charred stub afterwards. Whereas a tree that was alive is not likely to get that kind of deep burning into the wood on the tree bowl unless there was some old decay or an old wound. But trees that were like, maybe died the year or within a few months before the fire, it can be very hard to tell if that tree was, which trees were dead or alive before the fire. You'd have to dig into them and see how advanced the beetle activity was underneath the bark. Here's an example of sizing up a white fir and coming up with your crown length killed percent. So you can see where the crown base is on this tree. There's some other smaller trees in the bottom that have red needles, but those aren't part of this tree, of the larger tree. So that's where the crown base is on the bottom there. And then we pick the line of best fit towards the top to divide the crown kill area from the unburned. And for this tree, it's estimated about a 75% crown length kill. When you get into the pines, here we go again with this is probably a ponderosa or a Jeffrey. It's one or the other. I don't remember where this was at, but you got your healthy green needles at the top, unburned. In the middle is where you're likely to have scorched needles, but the buds survived. And this tree also shows a little bit of that crown thinning I was talking about. And then the lower portion of the crown is completely dead. Both needles and buds are dead, and the needle retention is much higher. And so for the portion of this crown, the original pre-fire crown that was killed, seems to be about 40%. And the portion that was scorched seems to be about 70%. So what's the importance of those percentages? Well, when we crank out our models here, those percentages help us get to a predicted probability of mortality. And this is just an example from incense cedar. And all of these model graphs I'm going to show you, some of them were made on preliminary data. I kind of picked the ones that just showed a really good diagram. So some of these don't represent the final data necessarily from our study. Just wanted to kind of throw that out there. But the bottom line is, so you look across the bottom, you got the percent crown length killed. As that increases, the predicted probability of mortality also increases. And so for incense cedar, really you need to get up to about 80% crown length killed before you start having a greater than 50-50 chance of a tree, or a 50% chance of a tree dying. Incense cedar proved to be very resilient to a large amount of crown loss. And we believe that has something to do with the lack of aggressive bark beetles on incense cedar. And these trees may have been allowed to kind of sustain their injuries without getting those secondary agents on them. Cambium injury. Sometimes it's very obvious. The bark is burned off down to the wood. It's pretty easy to tell where cambium is dead. But if that is not the case, then you got to dig into the bark. And when you dig into the bark, you're going to find either live or dead cambium. The dead cambium, picture on the left, Usually it's the phloem layer is either missing or it's very sticky, like chewing gum, and reddish. And as you dig deeper and you get into the xylem or the wood, you'll see brown staining on the wood. And the whole area is usually, it's either just dry and leathery or it's really resin impregnated, sticky. And then on the right, when you have live cambium, when you get down in there, it'll be moist, light colored, soft and pliable. And when you pull it out, the wood interface with the phloem, there'll be a lot of moisture and the wood will be light colored and wet. And so here's a tree we don't know. This is a tree where you'd want to potentially sample if you really wanted to know what happened underneath the bark here with this charring. And in this particular tree, we just went ahead and dissected it. And you can see, so I'll go back, you can see where that charring is around the base. This is a red fir. And when we remove the bark, all that charred area really represented some pretty intense heating that cooked the cambium layer and actually stained the sapwood underneath. And we have found over the years on our trees and looking at other true fir, red fir and white fir, that kind of cambium injury almost always leads to extensive decay. And even if the tree remains green, the base becomes so rotten in some instances that the wind and snow events in old burn areas have just toppled, hundreds of green trees that were hanging on from their fire injuries, but essentially had rotted out at the base. Large old pines, very thick bark. You would think that they would be able to sustain any fire, but in a lot of places where we haven't had fire in well over 100 years, there's an incredible amount of litter and duff that's accumulated around the base of these trees. And when that duff burns, it burns slowly and it burns for a long time. And so you can see on this pine, there was at least a foot of material there. It almost burns like briquettes. And the heating that can go on for hours and hours at lethal temperatures. So everything that shows purple and red and yellow in these pictures is lethal heating temperatures. So this was from another study where we looked at raked trees and unraked trees. We raked the duff and litter away from trees before a prescribed fire, but just wanted to show the level of heating that can occur around the base of these trees in that duff and litter. So for our study and then trying to take this to implementation in the field, we realized that sampling the cambium on every tree was probably going to be unrealistic. And so we tried to use a surrogate using bark char characteristics instead of sampling the cambium directly. And so we broke down the bark char into different categories. You can have unburned, which is the fire didn't touch it at all, or you can have light char. And this is where the fire blackened like the outer plates of the bark, but it didn't get into the furrows, so the furrows are unburned. Moderate would be everything is blackened, the plates and the furrows and the ridges, but the bark remains, it retains all of its characteristics that it had pre-fire. So it has the same patterns and texture as the unburned portion. When you get into deep char, that's where the bark has actually been burned off to some degree, maybe partially or entirely. And for the most part, if you find deep char on a tree, you can assume dead cambium underneath. Unburned, obviously you can assume live cambium. Light charring, you can assume unburned for almost all tree species, except for the very thin bark species like lodgepole pine and maybe white bark pine. And then moderate is pretty much a coin flip for most tree species. You really don't know what happened underneath with moderate char, except for Douglas fir, where if you have moderate charring, you can assume that the cambium underneath is alive. So what does cambium kill mean? So we did our 4 samples, and if the sample was dead, we counted it as 1. And so you could have a maximum of 4 dead samples on any given tree. And so for these 2 charts, I'm just showing you the difference of the predicted probability of mortality with different levels of cambium kill. So if you look at the red dots here on this ponderosa pine Jeffrey graph, this is the tree that represents that had no dead cambium samples. And so it takes greater than 60–70% crown length killed before that tree starts to have a greater than 50% chance of mortality. But a tree that had 4 dead cambium samples, for it to have a greater than 50% chance of mortality, it only needs about 50% crown length killed. So basically, the more cambium injury at the base, the less crown damage you need at the top to have the same level of predicted probability of mortality. For the sugar pine graph to the right, we found an interesting thing with sugar pine. 0 to 3 dead samples essentially were there was no difference between those. The big difference happened when you went to 4 dead samples, and the difference was dramatic. So you can see the change in the probability of mortality for any given percent crown length killed from the tree that had 4 dead cambium samples versus all the other trees that had less than 4. Red turpentine beetle. This is bark beetle, attacks all pines. It's very attracted to fire injuries, and it proved to be a very useful predictor, a useful variable in predicting tree mortality. The presence of these attacks alone does not mean a tree is going to die, but it does mean it has a slightly higher probability of mortality than the tree that's not attacked. And we simply looked at presence absence. So if there was one pitch tube, it didn't matter if there was one pitch tube or if there were dozens. It was merely presence absence that was meaningful. And so back to the models, you can see unattacked graph on the right, and then unattacked graph on the left for sugar pine, and then attacked tree on the right. And you can see how the presence of red turpentine beetle really bumped up the predicted probability of mortality for any given crown length kill, both for trees that had high levels of cambium injury and lesser amounts. Diameter. Diameter was not significant for incense cedar, sugar pine, or smaller diameter ponderosa and Jeffrey pine. So it didn't matter if the tree was 10 inches or 30 or 40 inches. There was no difference for diameter on predicting tree mortality. But we did find a difference with white fir and also with larger diameter pines. And I will we'll get to a table here and I'll show you those differences. So this is how those models get broken down into tables in our marking guidelines. And what we tried to do here was allow a land manager to decide at what level of probability of mortality would they like to, depending on their goals, if they wanted to remove trees for salvage harvest, or if they were concerned about trees for hazard situations, trees next to infrastructure or roads. It kind of gave them a flexibility to choose their comfort level. And so the more you go to the right on this table on the top row for the probability of mortality, the more conservative you're being. So if you choose to mark trees at a 90% probability of mortality level, you're really giving most of the trees out there the benefit of the doubt and allowing them to kind of play themselves out. So it's a very conservative mark. And then as you go for lower probabilities of mortality, you're being much more aggressive. So you're willing to take trees that may have had some chance of living. You can't afford to leave those trees out there. And that's usually when we get into hazard tree situations, or we simply don't want a lot of dead trees on the landscape for post-fire fuel loading. And so we may choose to be a little bit more aggressive. I have found that 0.7 under most conditions seems to be a pretty good benchmark to start with. People can flex around that. One size does not fit all. You can pick different probabilities of mortality for different tree species or different management objectives. But for this table, I just wanted to show you, we'll just look at the 0.7 probability column. And so the top one is for yellow pine. And this is, if you're looking at a tree right after the fire, when all you know is that the crown is scorched, you really don't have any idea what the bud survival is. And so you can see that for a 70% probability of mortality, for a tree that's 10 to 30 inches in diameter, it would take 90% crown scorch to have that 70% chance of mortality. Now, as we move down the rows, you'll see as the diameters get bigger, the 30 to 40 inch trees, 40 to 50 inch trees, it takes less crown damage to achieve the same probability of mortality. And so that's kind of counterintuitive. You think that larger trees might be able to sustain more damage and not have a lower probability of mortality, but that was not the case in our study for the white fir and the larger diameter pine. And there's some reasons. I mean, we can throw out some speculation there. Larger trees might be more attractive to bark beetles. Some of these old large trees might have been less vigorous than some of the younger trees. And the other thing is, I can't remember what the third one was, but yeah, so there's a few different reasons why that might be. Oh, the root damage and the cambium damage around the base. Like I showed you the pictures of those large trees sustaining lots of heating, and that could be playing a role in what we see in these numbers as well. So the top table is what we call the pre-bud break level, and that, like I said, that's the one we use right after the fire, looking at crown scorch when we don't know what the bud survival is. When we get into the following growing season, and we call this, we can use the next table, and that's the post-bud break table. So this is when we can actually start to see that new green growth popping up in the scorched portion of the crown. And then we switch how we look at the trees. We're not looking at the crown scorch anymore. We're looking for the portions of the crown that have that new growth, and we're breaking it down by crown kill. And so it takes a lot less crown kill than crown scorch for the same diameter tree and the same probability of mortality. So if you look up above at the 70% level, 10 to 30 inch tree takes 90% crown length scorch to achieve that probability of mortality. And then down below in the post bud break table, we're just looking at crown kill, it would take only 60% crown kill to achieve that. And that just represents the difference between scorch kill and crown. We were intending to do Douglas fir when we started our study, but we just didn't have the opportunity. But since then, we have followed, I think we've got about 400 trees that we followed for 5 years. This is really raw data, not analyzed, but Douglas fir from our 2 studies, one on the Stanislaus, one on the Six Firs National Forest, really shows a pattern similar to incense cedar, where it takes a lot of crown kill to start getting a significant increase in the percent mortality. And so this may also have to do with what I've observed in Northeastern California is a lack of Douglas fir beetle in our area relative to other Western states. And without that aggressive beetle in the mix, it may allow these severely damaged trees to hang on. This is a 5-year window. We pretty much ended it there, but I have gone back to areas 10 years later and seen, during the next drought window, a lot of trees that were injured succumb ultimately to they ultimately die during that next disturbance event drought. So 5 years, this is what it looks like, but it could increase over time. And I'll stop there with any questions.
Thanks, Danny. There is one question in chat, and if you have some questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat as well. So Jeff asks, are the insects that you're describing in your presentation, are they native to California or to our ecosystems?
Yes. So at least in Northeastern California, we don't have any invasive, there are non-natives here, but we don't really have anything that's of a management concern that I'm aware of. Hopefully that stays that way. Other parts of California, Southern California, we have some invasive bark and wood boring beetles down there that could come into the mix in some of these trees, but I have not seen that. Everything that I've dealt with up here in Northeastern California, Northern California, is native bark and wood boring beetles.
And then Marissa asked, what is the name of the beetle that affects the Doug fir? And did you say that it's not in California?
So Douglas fir beetle is the primary bark beetle for Douglas fir in the West. It is native to California. It is here. It's just been my experience, and I haven't heard any different from most people. We just don't see a lot of Douglas fir beetle activity post-fire, at least in Northeastern California. Maybe a little bit different when you get over to the coast, and maybe Mike has seen something over there that speak later, but we really see the most insect activity we see in Douglas fir after fire is from wood boring beetles, and specifically one that we call the flat-headed fir borer. And so I don't know exactly why we don't see more Douglas fir beetle activity in California like other parts of the West. You get fire injured Doug fir in Idaho, a place like Idaho, and you will get Douglas fir beetle outbreaks that will kill a lot of fire injured trees and then potentially build up their populations and spread out to unburned stands of Douglas fir. We don't tend to see that here with the fire. We have had big Douglas fir beetle outbreaks in California from wind throw events, very few and far between.
Yeah, well, Marissa is on the North Coast, so it could be a little different. Yeah, we'll let Mike respond to that. What is the pest that is on your question slide there?
That is one of the dendroctonous bark beetles. It's either, I don't know which one that is. It's either a western pine beetle or probably mountain pine beetle. Might even be red turpentine beetle, but I couldn't tell for sure.
Any other questions for Danny? Well, excellent presentation, Danny. Much appreciated. And if you have any other questions for him, you can continue to put them in the chat. That would be great. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mike now. So Danny, if you could stop sharing, and then we'll let Mike take over and introduce yourself. Like probably everybody on the call knows you, Mike.
I would think so at this point. Oh, there we go. So much. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for having me. My name is Michael Jones. I am the UC Extension Forester for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma Counties. I'm an entomologist by training, so I'm certainly not as advanced in my career as Danny, but just like him, I've been studying forest pests and diseases for most of my career. So what I'm going to talk about is basically the same thing Danny was talking about, but looking at oaks and redwoods. And, you know, I'm actually going to cover a lot of the same areas that he talked about. And what's interesting about what I'll be talking about is how weird and alien these trees are and compared to the conifers that Danny was talking about, and how just kind of completely different their life history strategies for dealing with fire, and how that affects how we think about post-fire management and restoration and dealing with wildfire in these types of forest systems. So I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but I think it's really important to set up this conversation because there's an important part of these ecosystems. It's a common disturbance. We live in a Mediterranean climate where fire has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. It's shaped the flora and fauna, and so we've developed these. But the trees have developed these life history strategies, and I'm going to collectively call them fire tolerance and fire embracing. And this is really important in this conversation because you'll see the differences in the way the trees respond to fire and how that affects your management decisions and maybe what your goals and objectives are after fire. So the first one is fire tolerance, and this the basic idea is that the trees can tolerate actually being on fire and actually damage to their tissue. So trees that we typically think of being fire tolerant have thicker bark, self-pruning branches so that, you know, they remove that ladder fuel, if you all familiar with that term, but basically the idea is that we keep the fire on the ground instead of it crowning out and killing all the foliage and burning really hot the bark. Like Danny was talking about, we'll talk about what that can do and how you assess that damage. But we typically think of fire tolerant trees as, you know, usually bigger trees. A lot of our oaks with our thick bark, our black oaks, our blue oaks, valley oak, coast live oaks are all very fire tolerant. If you've seen that picture on the upper left, you see that that's a black oak. You see in the outer bark about an inch in, darker, got that black line, and then you kind of go inside that black line and the bark is creamier, and then we get to the cambium. We'll talk about that as Danny was mentioning. That's healthy cambium, that's living bark, and the outer bark has been killed by the fire. So the tree actually tolerated quite a significant amount of damage, but the really important tissues, woody tissues beneath it are still healthy and alive. And also, so our other fire tolerant species are redwood, right? Redwood has really thick fibrous bark. actually made to burn. And so it's really interesting when you see redwoods burn, even in prescribed fire or low severity or low intensity burns, you see fire carrying pretty high up the stem. And that's a really adaptive strategy in which the tree has evolved this bark that it's fibrous and it's flammable, but what that does is it keeps that latent heat, that concentrated heat that Danny showed that really cool flare imagery of, from concentrating on the cambium and killing that tissue, and kind of carries the fire up real quick and kind of helps to keep it off of the wood. And so Doug fir also has pretty thick bark, and we'll talk about a little bit about this as Danny did, but you know, it's relatively fire tolerant, at least the really large mature trees are that are still very vigorous. But we're seeing that under the conditions which fires are burning right now, and especially with post-fire drought conditions, they're having a hard time persisting, even under relatively low severity, moderate severity fire. And I think there's a lot of factors there, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But basically, I think the idea is that there's a lot of fuel buildup, and even if you only have a thick layer of dust, I think that's enough to really cook the lower part of the stem and the roots and cause some significant damage. The other strategy, which is pretty amazing in my mind, is fire embracing. Basically, I'm going to anthropomorphize this. The tree essentially says, you know what, instead of investing a lot of resources in developing tissues and mechanisms to tolerate damage, right? This is a pretty physiologically expensive process. I'm just going to accept the fact that when fire burns, and it burns intense enough and high enough severity, that it'll kill my above ground biomass, but I'll have all of these reserves in my below ground roots and my below ground tissue systems that I'll regenerate through a resprout. And so typically we think of trees that are fire embracing as having thinner bark. As you can see in the top right, that photo in the top right left, that makes sense, is interior live oak. You can see that as opposed to that previous image, that cambium, that wood tissue is just really cooked and that bark is completely dead and consumed for the most part. And so the above ground biomass dies, but the tree rapidly within weeks essentially will resprout and start over. And so we think of these as a few of our live oaks. Most of our native hardwoods have this capacity. Conifers are to some extent, not with resprouting, but if you think about serotinous species that use fire or intense heat to release seed, and that understory removal of competitive vegetation and kind of release of nutrients helps us out, helps, you know, trigger the conditions that those next generation of conifers can establish into. But it's really important to recognize that even if a tree is fire tolerant in the oaks and the redwoods, they certainly have the capacity to resprout following pretty significant fire events. So I think that's important to lay out because that's going to determine, you know, that's going to help us decide how we assess the damage or how we predict whether a tree or not a tree is going to survive. And it's a little bit different than when we look at conifers. And I'll talk a little bit about Doug fir, since that's kind of the primary conifer that we deal with in these situations. But it's kind of similar mechanisms that Danny looks at, but we certainly have different responses and we think about it differently. So we look at bark scorching as kind of that first observational kind of determination of maybe what the impact was. When you look at cambium, root damage, canopy torching, and right, it's really kind of maybe partially intuitive, partially non-intuitive, but bigger trees can tolerate more damage usually, and conifers are less tolerant of fire damage than hardwoods and the redwoods. And the reason, you know, we look at those variables and we come up with a burn severity kind of index. And the reason we want to use this is because it helps with our management objectives, right? So we think about, as we're managing our forest land after fire, what are our goals and objectives and how are we going to delineate, right? When we're thinking about our management plan, we're delineating our management unit. We're determining what our prescriptions might be within those management units and what kind of funding we're going to need, what kind of implementation we might need. And when we're dealing with fire, it's really important to actually lay that out because there might be areas where on the left you have what we call low severity fire or burn, where, you know, that doesn't require a lot of post management, to moderate in the center where Danny said, you know, it's a little bit of either or. The trees will die, some of them are probably fine, we'll have some understory mortality, to high severity burn where we're thinking about, are we salvage logging or what are some of our management options in these systems and how are we doing forest restoration, post-fire management. And that's important. Again, I just want to point this out because it helps us frame our management goals and objectives contrary to how we kind of see fire, wildfire in the media, the burn severity, the way fires burn, is very heterogeneous, right? So not the entire fire footprint is going to have 100% crown fire or 100% stand replacement event. We're going to have a lot of mix in there. And so it's really important that when we're thinking about this, that we're thinking about what are the species that occur in these sites, where are our burn severity the highest, where are we prioritizing these goals and objectives for post-fire management, first priority, quickest things that we want to address, or maybe not. Maybe we're going to sit and wait. And so we'll talk about more of that at the end when I talk about management considerations. But it's really important to remember that when we first assess after a fire, that it's not going to be one uniform, oh, everything's kind of the same condition, what are we going to do? There's certainly going to be a lot of heterogeneity in that burn severity and the way the forest structure and condition is following a fire, and that'll really affect how we approach management. So the first thing we want to look at when we're kind of assessing burn severity is bark scorching. Just as Danny said, it's a way to kind of gauge or make a really rapid and quick assessment of how much damage is there potentially to this tree. So, for example, if on the left photo, you see that this is a blue oak. You can tell that a lot of the architecture of the bark is still there. So it still has the bark cracks and the outer bark is still in pretty good shape. Really what burned on this particular tree was just the moss. We would probably assume that that's a low severity burn, that the woody tissue beneath is probably relatively healthy. But then we can go all the way to high severity damage where we have a lot of the architecture is consumed, a lot of the wood is consumed, or excuse me, the bark is consumed. And in some cases we have burned wood. Here's redwoods with that. We see that we had a fairy ring and it burned out in the middle, and you can see that it burned through very thick bark and did a lot of damage to the wood. So that's a pretty easy way to assess damage quickly without a lot of destructive or labor intensive practices to kind of determine what we need to do with these trees, right? This is pretty on the right. You can kind of make the assumption that those trees are going to struggle, and they may not be completely dead, but the above ground biomass, the part of the tree we can see, is most certainly probably going to die or be significantly impacted. The best way for oaks and redwoods is really to assess the cambium. And so the cambium, as we kind of talked about, is that it's a really thin layer, it's usually a couple of cells thick, of tissue that sits right on top of the wood, right under the bark. It's really the only active growing part of the main stem of a tree. If it divides out, it becomes bark. If it divides in, it becomes wood. It's where all the nutrient transportation occurs. So if you kill that and you girdle the tree, meaning you kill all the way around the main stem, you basically starve that tree to death. So the best way to determine how much damage there was from fire is to assess the health of the cambium. The more damage you have, the more significant that impact to the vigor and survival of that tree will be. So here's again a fire tolerant oak species, really thick bark. I think this is might be black oak again. We see that there was quite a bit of damage to the bark, but we see that cambium is this creamy white color. It's still very healthy. When you hack into the tree with a hatchet and you feel that cambium, it's moist, sticky, has a sweet smell to it. There's a lot of sugar in there. Bears love it, by the way, and they like to strip redwood bark to eat it. But when you have your cambium in this condition, you know it's pretty healthy. Again, here's an interior live oak. You see that the fire is heating, has gone all the way into the wood and the tissue and killed that cambium. So kind of a mottled brown, gray color, dry to the touch. This is pretty cool. This is a redwood. Where the white arrow is, the cambium on the left is still alive. This cambium is dead. This is towards the center of the fairy ring. This is away. And so you actually see that you have this zone of mortality, or the mortality of the cambium, but the rest of the tree is healthy and alive. These are important things to think about when you're assessing your trees for survival. Another good way, and a kind of fun way to assess cambium damaged redwoods, is if you don't want to hack into the bark like Danny was suggesting, or I do often. You can do what we call a sounding test. And if you take a mallet or an axe or some blunt object and wail on the side of a tree really hard, depending on the kind of sound you get, you can make a pretty good guess at what condition the cambium is. If you get a dull thud, it's living because all that water absorbs the vibrations, and it means the cambium is still healthy. If you get an echo, just like if you were to knock on wood, like a piece of lumber, it kind of vibrates more, and so you can tell that that's dead woody tissue. Kind of a fun demonstration when you're in the field. Next one we're looking at is root damage. So again, the more damage we have to the roots, the more significant impact there will be to survival. More likely we'll have mortality of the above ground biomass. Most importantly, too, with roots is that you start getting structural issues. So even if you have 25, 50% of the root circumference damaged and the tree is still alive, because you've damaged so much of that anchoring structure, that stability of the tree, it could still have potential failure and it could become a hazard tree, something that needs to be considered. And so you can see in these particular trees, this is an oak that, it still has the foliage and it still has the fine twigs and branches in the canopy. So it's not that there was a ton of fire crowning out in this tree. It's that there was a lot of vegetation, something on the forest floor below it. It looks like it chimneyed out a little bit, that the heat just cooked the main stem and the roots. You can see by the fact that nothing is regrowing in the grasses, that tree's outright killed. Same thing happens in the redwoods. You see a lot of root consumption in these fairy rings. Here, a whole root burned out. And those are trees that, you're probably going to have very little resprout or little regenerative capacity, and they might be truly dead. And so that's really important to keep an eye on. Roots burning out underground is also a consideration for hazard. And when you're thinking about roads and erosion, we can talk about that maybe a little bit later for a second. When it comes to canopy torching, which I mean, the paper that Danny put together and the research they did is phenomenal. And that's an amazing reference that I use and I recommend people use a lot. But unfortunately, in these kind of fire-embracing species that they can resprout, or redwoods, for example, which are just kind of alien trees, they can produce epicormic sprouting from basically every tissue structure. Canopy torching isn't a guarantee that you're looking at mortality or significant damage. And all these oaks here, a lot of these are deciduous oaks. And this, I wish I had an update photo on this, but this site looks like it really is hard to tell. It burned a couple of years after this particular fire. At this site, a lot of these trees, these are redwoods that have pretty significant canopy damage. But all of them have resprouted, and some of them are looking pretty good by this point. So canopy torching for oaks and redwoods is not necessarily a very good indication, whereas with the conifers that we were talking about earlier and Doug fir, it's pretty good that when you have a significant amount of damage to the canopy, you can expect a higher probability of mortality. And so what's really neat about these trees is we use all of those factors to kind of assess their survival and their ability to persist. But even if they have pretty significant damage, we can still expect and often see some pretty incredible regeneration pretty quickly. So if that cambium isn't killed, and on oaks, I've seen trees with 1 or 2 inches of cambium still alive persist for years that way. And if the redwood, these redwoods were this was a crowning fire in these redwoods, right? It completely consumed the foliage, consumed a lot of the fine branches. But you see, we call it their sprouting. We call it bottle brushing. They're sprouting from the main stem. Given time, these sprouts will replace these branches, and it'll form a new canopy. It will take several decades, if not longer. But physiologically, ecologically, these trees are still alive. And so that's kind of challenging because there's not very many other conifers that can have that kind of vigorous resprouting capacity. Oaks do the same thing, right? They might produce epicormic sprouts up in the canopy to reproduce some of that photosynthetic tissue, or they may start over and produce the basal sprouts and regenerate from the reserves underground. And then redwoods will do the same thing. If there's less damage, they will just vigorously resprout from the base. So these trees have just incredible capacity to regenerate, which can make it a little bit challenging when we're thinking about management, because what we initially see right after the fire might not necessarily reflect what's actually physiologically happening to those trees. Insects and diseases, really important conifers, as Danny pointed out, right? Even in our area, we have Sierra foothill pine, Doug fir, what else we have? Gray pine, right? When they burn, the insects and go after them pretty hard. But not so much in our hardwoods, right? Here, this is a really interesting tree. This is a black oak. This black line is the kind of margin of the dead cambium. So this dead cambium, this part of the tree is alive. We see there's lots of these flat-headed boards and cerambycic galleries feeding in the dead part, but they don't even cross into the living tissue. And I find that pretty consistently that even if a tree has 50% damage, The insect damage is limited to the parts of the tree that are dead. The rest of the trees are fine. So insects and diseases are not necessarily as big of a concern in oaks and other hardwoods and redwoods because these trees are just super resilient to those kinds of disturbances. However, resprouts are in oaks or in hardwoods are particularly vulnerable to powdery mildew, which can be, I don't think it's lethal, but it can certainly restrict and reduce the amount of growth. And if you're dealing with other environmental factors like drought, it may have a pretty significant long-term impact on your ability to regenerate. I think probably the biggest issue we have in this regeneration is browse from wildlife. They can go after trees pretty hard and crop back that regeneration pretty significantly. And so maybe we'll talk about that for a second, about how we kind of manage for that. And then there was a question about drought in there in the regeneration. I think we're looking at oaks and these hardwoods in particular are very well adapted to this Mediterranean climate and drought, right? Basically being without water through a pretty warm season. And I think their capacity to survive is pretty good. However, it does have an impact. I'd certainly noticed that, a few years after some of these fires, we have really vigorous growth. And last year in particular, it seemed like there was a lot of drought mortality associated with some of the smaller sprouts in the trees that were a little bit more marginal. But there's still a significant amount of survival. And I think that in the long term, as long as we don't have persistent, significant drought events, which, who knows at this point with climate change, I think the oaks will be resprouting fine. It just might take a little bit longer and maybe require a little bit more hands-on from us to get them to a more resilient and sustainable condition. So hazard trees is really important. We want to think about these trees. I talked about how resilient the redwoods and the oaks are, but if they chimney out or if they goose pan burns and they smolder, redwoods can smolder in the fairy ring or the base for months after a fire. And those can be pretty significant hazards. So even maybe the above ground biomass will survive. Ultimately, maybe that tree needs to be removed from a risk perspective, or because it's been undermined and the roots are failing and it could fall into a utility or right of way or cause damage, or roadside clearing. So even if the trees have this capacity to regenerate, and the damage is not significant, they might present future challenges as they do get maybe some disease or other factors that might get introduced into the wounds caused by the fire. And as I mentioned, if there's root damage, then there's more structural potential or structural issues and potential for failure. So it's something to consider when we're thinking about management. So let's talk about management considerations. As you all know, this is our favorite term, or in the Forest Stewardship Workshop series. And also the same thing I say to every client I visit is how you manage your forest and natural resources depends entirely on your goals and objectives. If you're really serious about aggressively managing, then the first place that you need to go is to consult with a registered professional forester. When you're thinking about redwoods and oaks and other hardwoods, I think there's potential, and this certainly depends on a lot of factors, but I think less can be more. And I say that because when you're dealing with conifers and you have a significant fire event, you have a very short window in which you can potentially salvage or really think about your management goals and objectives before insects come in there and really wreak havoc on the trees and start to cause a lot of problems. But with these systems, because they can resprout, because they can regenerate in much more aggressive and different ways than the conifers, maybe you give the system time to naturally recover before you make any management decisions. It's just entirely up to your goals and objectives, but there is more room to think about, how you're going to respond. Of course, the market and the way wood selling and buying goes, that there might be an issue in that sense. But from an ecological perspective, it certainly is time that you can give the system to recover. We talked about MAP severity early on, or burn severity, excuse me. So one thing that you can do is, as you're evaluating your property, is to map that burn severity, determine where your high severity burn spots are, and maybe that's where you want to do salvage, or maybe you're going to kind of isolate that area because it's full of hazards and you've got a lot of snags now, so it's wildlife, but you don't want to go in there because of the risk, or maybe you're worried about the fuels buildup. But if you know where it is on the map, you can address it much more aggressively, or in a much more thoughtful way if you know where it is and how big it is. Assess infrastructure, right? We're not thinking about buildings themselves, but roads, resources that are on site that might have been damaged. manage those hazard trees I talked about. And if you want salvage, and I think that's a perfectly viable option, the burned redwood have value. They will eventually get rot. They do have heart rot. And from an ecological perspective, that's not a big deal. I've seen old redwood everybody has with big, huge burn scars in them, but they're still over hundreds of years old. But from a market perspective, if you want to salvage that wood, you might need to think about, at some point taking that down in a timely manner. If you have a management plan in place, maybe you think about what you're going to do now, right? Maybe this has changed your goals and objectives, and you're thinking about how am I going to do forest restoration now? And what's really important to remember here is that, right, not only are we thinking about if we have to replant, vegetation management, and controlling weeds, whatever else we might have to deal with, this is a long-term project, right? It's not just kind of we go in there once and we clean up and we're good to go. Just like with normal forest management, we have to think about this as every 5-10 years we're coming in and managing the system. So a really good way to determine how your forest is recovering, or if the management that you've done in that system is on track to what your expectations are, or what you had wanted to see, is to use photo points. And so take pictures of areas that you managed or areas you're worried about and see how they change in time, so that you can determine what is maybe you want to do from a management perspective, or if the work that you have been doing is that you're achieving that goals and objectives. So, and I just want a couple examples. This particular site, this is a nice site. It has a little bit of everything in it. We got redwood, we have Doug fir, we have ponderosa pine here with a bunch of oaks in the understory and other hardwoods. This site was salvaged, but you still see that there's a lot of trees that are dead and weren't salvaged, or that have died since. Here's a redwood with that really good bottle brushing. This is about 5 years after the fire. But we see just the carpet of regeneration in the understory, and all those hardwoods are resprouting. They went from single stem trees or multi-stem trees to basically huge shrubs. Something we have to think about if we're thinking about fire perspective. Salvage in here. So we removed a lot of those big trees, and just because I thought what the owners had done, this is the salvaged lumber. This is the Doug fir that they had salvaged, and this is the redwood they had salvaged from that burn. So I thought it was a really cool way to kind of reincorporate that into the property. But this is on the same property in the area they haven't salvaged. So you have two areas with, as 5 years after the wildfire, that you have very different fuel loading, but of course, very much a lot of fuel has built up since then. You have a lot of hazard trees in these kinds of areas. And so these are things that you have to think about managing. And also erosion is another one. We always get really excited when we have fire and it flicks off all the vegetation and like, oh, we need to put all this erosion control in. Again, maybe we give the system a little bit of time to wait. Certainly if you have high severity fire and you have a stand replacement event and there's no biomass left over, you're gonna have to think about, oh, how are you gonna control that? But in the system, particularly in redwoods where the fire stand on the ground, or maybe it's just produced enough heat to kill a lot of the needles, a lot of that needle fall, that needle cast will provide some protection and help with water penetration. So again, give it a little bit of time if you can to let the system naturally recover before we aggressively re-enter and think about what we're going to do. We have a lot of resources. Like I said, we don't have as robust a study as the Forest Service and Danny has done with their decision tree. A lot of the data on redwoods is anecdotal, a few studies here and there. But we do have a lot of resources that can help you make the decisions. There's a lot of information on redwood. I have a lot of good resources for dealing post-fire in the coastal ranges, as well as UC Oaks website has some good stuff on oaks. And I just wanted to say before I forgot, just as Dan was saying with Doug fir, I didn't mention some insects and diseases. Yeah, we don't have a lot of Doug fir beetle. We have flat-headed fir borer as well, and I rarely see Doug fir beetle except for in wind-thrown trees. So it's very interesting to see it pop up when it does. But yeah, it's an interesting. Doug fir is an interesting one that, like I said, it's evolved to be fire tolerant, but it's struggling, and I'm not sure why. It's having a lot of trouble right now, and I think maybe that might be part of because it removed fire from these systems. And in the coast range, they're expanding their range and growing into different habitat types that maybe not are as high quality sites for them, and so they're just not as resilient or as healthy in those sites. All right, well, thank you, and hopefully, I can take questions now, or maybe, I don't know if we have time at the end after Ryan speaks to kind of talk collectively about this, but thanks for your time, and feel free to reach out if you have questions, or if you're interested in a site visit or talking more about this.
Thank you, Mike. Well, let's Go ahead. There are two questions in the chat box. Let's go ahead and address those before we turn it over to Ryan. So Jeff asked, does the presence of basil sprouting in redwoods indicate the tree is quote unquote given up on resprouting higher on the tree? So in other words, is basil sprouting an indication the tree is fatally damaged?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, with redwoods, so right, they map the genome sequence. It's this hugely complex genome sequence, and there's a lot of phenotypic plasticity in those trees. And so you could have a redwood growing in the middle of a forest, and all of a sudden all these trees coming down around it. Maybe you did a harvest, or maybe there's wind throw. And just because you put more light on that tree, it'll start sprouting from everywhere, right? From the stem, from the branches, from the base. It doesn't necessarily mean that the above ground biomass is going to die. And the same is true for fires. Maybe because that tree all of a sudden now has a much more light penetration to the main stem or to different parts of the tree, it may just start to produce epicormic growth. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that's true for redwoods. For oaks, I do think that's true. I think what you see happening with oaks is if they don't have, say they have a fairly significant amount of damage to the canopy, but there's still a little bit of the cambium alive. I see what I kind of think what I see happening is they'll produce a lot of epicormic sprouting to create photosynthetic capacity to then pull insurers and pull them into the reserves so that they can have more robust resprouts. So if you see an oak with both epicormic sprouts and basal sprouts, I believe that eventually the basal sprouts will win over. That may be true in the redwoods long term, but I think they can persist with both for a very long time. Really the only way to confirm is to test and assess the cambium and how much of it's dead or alive. So I don't know. It's a good question, Jeff, and I'm just not sure, honestly, if that's going to be the case or not 100% of the time.
So Glenn has a question, and I'll open this up to both you and Danny. Wildfires of different intensities will have their respective chemistries, like PAHS or ozone are generated. Has anyone assessed canopy damage from such exposure, such as chlorotic mottling or tip necrosis from ozone?
I guess, I mean, there's certainly been a lot of research on the impact of ozone and needle chlorosis. I'm not sure if you mean in context to like if they're in the fire footprint or if the kind of pollution created by wildfire has impact. But there certainly is in Southern California. There's this nice, if you go up into the San Bernardino National Forest, there's this nice like inversion layer where you can see all the ozone and pollution sits at a level, and there's like ozone damage on the foliage, and that kind of stuff has been studied, and they certainly do know that it can be pretty significant and have long-term physiological impacts. But I don't know, Danny might know, I mean, how if anybody specifically has looked at that in relationship to like wildfire pollution.
Yeah, I don't know of anything like that, Mike.
Kevin does ask, what were some of the management options for hardwood sprouts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't really, I kind of glossed over that when I showed those like 5-year post images. So it's tricky, right? So there's a lot of factors that we're thinking about here. Number one is if you have a lot of resprouting hardwoods near your infrastructure, you're worried about fuel loading, right? You're going to have a significant change in the structure and composition of the forest. And that's an incredible fuel loading where you've shifted a lot of stuff that was mature trees up in the canopy down to shrubby growth. So one thing I mentioned is that browsing can be really significant on hardwood resprouts. If you leave the dead main stem there and the sprouts grow up around it, what happens is the sprouts literally prevent the deer or whatever wildlife are browsing from getting to the main stem, because as they crop the sprouts, they shrub out and they grow bigger. And eventually the deer will start browsing the outer parts of the resprouts, but not hit the interior part. And so now you've protected them and they grow above the browse height and they survive. So I think one way that you can manage if you're worried about fuel loading on the landscape, right? If we're out in the wilderness, I'm going to say I probably wouldn't do too much about it because it's going to be a lot of work and it's very expensive unless you can get some funding or you have the capacity to do that work. But within defensible spaces, high priority areas, maybe you let the resprouts and the main stem tissue stay there as long as you can. And then as soon as the sprouts get big enough, you prune out the dead and thin the sprouts back. And so you take out the dead material and then you prune the sprouts, because as you all know, they can be very vigorous, right? You can have 50 plus sprouts per madrone stem. And when they get to 6 or so feet tall, maybe you prune them back to the 3 most vigorous, or maybe even the single most dominant. And that's your selective tree that regenerates. If you do that too soon, they're just going to keep resprouting vigorously. If you remove the dead part of the tree, then you're maybe more susceptible to browsing. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do hardwood sprout management. I think it really depends on what your goals and objectives are and what you're open to, right? You can do herbicides, you can do hand thinning, you can use grazing, pruning, mastication. There's a lot of different tools you can use, but remember that these trees have very vigorous capacity for resprouting, and no matter what you do, aside from herbicide, they are going to come back in some capacity, and it's going to be a continuous management practice.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to Ryan's presentation.
Okay, how does that look? Can you all hear me?
Yes, you're
Okay,
good.
great. Thanks. Hey, well, good evening. Hey, first I'm going to say it's a pleasure to follow both Danny and Mike, both great colleagues of mine. Danny has advised me on many a post-fire restoration project, and Mike I oftentimes go to with my entomology and disease questions as well. So, and I think what I will be presenting on hopefully will build off of what they're talking about. I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about post-fire restoration conditions or considerations, and so much of the decision-making we make around trees and whether or not to retain them it's an inherent part in our forest restoration goals and objectives, whatever you decide they are as a landowner or land manager. Here is an example of a non-industrial private forest landowner who was affected by the 2020 Claremont fires. I should mention I am located in the Northern Sierra in Plumas County near Quincy. And so most of what I will be talking about will be Sierra specific. That's not to say that some of these concepts, however, couldn't be translated to different forest types in California. So if you do have a question or some nuance, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, as Mike sort of touched on as he was closing out his talk, so much of this is dependent on your goals and objectives. And for those of you who have been impacted by a fire, or for those of you who are helping manage other folks who have been impacted by fire, that post-fire assessment is so important, not only in the data that we can collect and the field surveys, but also strategically thinking about both short-term goals and objectives and long-term goals and objectives, and how that fits into a long-term fire restoration strategy. And I've sort of highlighted Susie and Kristen Shives' Recovering from Wildfire Guide. There's a link there. And so often this includes sort of reaching out to technical assistance, whether that's cooperative extension or forest health or a local RCE or a registered professional forester. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is these post-fire environments in particular are so dynamic. Things are changing from year to year, whether that is hazard, wood deterioration, understory recovery, snag fall. And so as a landowner or land manager, I really sort of challenge you to think dynamically and really think about, like, almost as if you were taking a VHS or a DVD and fast forwarding it and rewinding it in your mind as you think about these goals and objectives, and also as you think about your management actions and how that is going to modify succession in either a large part or a small part. This is a photo from a fire that was this is about 10 years after the fire. The other thing that I always tell everyone, Danny knows this, I've been working in post-fire environments for 2 decades now, and I think there's been few years when I've been out in the woods and not heard or seen a tree fall or a limb fall. And safety is so important. And I like to think that's not just because of my poor decision making. But when you're thinking about your plans, particularly if this is your own property or where your residence is located, I really want you to think about safety, both in the first year after the fire and extending into the first decade after the fire. And the first is the immediate hazard. And so I want to emphasize here that trees, we always think of trees falling in their entirety, but most often these trees fall in part through partial deterioration, a limb or a top, something with enough weight that's falling from 80 feet, which is enough to do a lot of damage. And unfortunately, people in the natural resources careers oftentimes get injured through this mechanism. And so I think it's really important when you're thinking about tree removal to really think about hazard trees. And if it's a property that you own, I encourage you to get a hard hat, number 1, and wear it, number 2. And number 3, have really good situational awareness about the weather of the day. You know, when are the winds picking up? When are the winds dying down? What is, did you have a lot of moisture that could make some trees susceptible to wind throw? Or is there a snow load in your trees? These are all sort of things that you need to know if you are working in a post-fire landscape. The other sort of mechanism of dynamics or change on this landscape is this 21st century disturbance, whether it is fire, which I'm depicting here, or drought, or perhaps the cumulative or the interaction of the two. You can see my hometown Quincy is here in the middle of the slide. And this is the last 20 years of fires and fire severity in my neck of the woods. And you can see there's a lot of red on this map that is high severity fire. And so not only is this, just sort of an emotional issue, perhaps for myself, but it's also an issue that we are seeing at greater extents and greater scales and greater patch sizes and severities. And really these events or these shifts in our disturbance regimes are really occurring with rather uncertain temporal legacies in our forested ecosystems in California. And so I'm actually going to highlight some of the research that my wife does. This is a paper that they did in 2016, where we're really seeing high severity fire beget more high severity fire. This is an example from the 2000 Story fire. You can see this large patch of high severity fire, which is, it's on the scale of hundreds and thousands of acres, which is way outside the natural range of variability for the dry mixed conifer forests we manage in the Sierra Nevadas. A high severity patch should be about 25 acres in size. We are much bigger. We're having fire severity in patches on magnitudes larger than that. But what we found, or which they found in this study, is that high severity fire had the propensity to beget more high severity fire. And you can see in the photo pair, that's the same photo taken from the same place, or two photos taken from the same place. You can see the very real world consequences that reburns can have and are having. And we're seeing increase in this type of fire behavior and fire severity, particularly in the Northern Sierra Nevada and the areas that I work in. So as you think of your post-fire restoration plans, I really want you to think about how these landscapes may burn again, and build that into your strategy and your tactics. As both Danny and Mike mentioned, I really want you to think of the development of fuel profiles over time, particularly for California forests in a changing climate where we're seeing fire seasons extend. We're also seeing an increase in an ERC, or energy release component, which is a metric of drying in our forests. And so we need to be prepared for these forests to burn again. And that should act into our management decisions. I like to call this photo, I wish I had site prepped. This is a stand that I was managing when I worked for the Forest Service. We planted this stand without salvaging. This is 5 years after the planting. I have some nice little artificial regen growing here, but you can see the development of this fuel profile. And I want to draw your attention to that buckskin snag in the background with the red arrow. That's the same snag 8 years after planting. So you can just see how many snags had fallen in those 3 years. You can see more dead and down, readily available heavy and activity fuels on the site. And you can actually see the growth of this, this shrub and forb component, which provides an intermix of this jackstrawed tree material. And so we really have a very novel fuel bed here at a very large scale that we wouldn't have expected under natural conditions. Now I'd like to draw your attention to that little black stubby snag in the background, because this is what it looked like. Oh, this is 11 years after that plantation. You can see this plantation burned in the 2019 Walker fire. And the great regeneration that I thought I had was vulnerable to high severity reburn. And I will get back to this picture, but maybe a little bit later in my talk. Here's another example from the 2012 Chips fire. This stand was actually salvaged, where they took out, we took out all the merchantable material, with the exception of the material that we wanted to retain for our snag retention and wildlife habitat requirements. However, you can see this sea of submerchantable small material, which did not pay its way out of the woods, and represents the development of a fuel profile that would be pretty problematic in the first decade or two. I'm going to draw your attention to those two trees in the back again. You can see after the post-fire salvage logging left, in this case, because it didn't treat that submerchantable component, as in sometimes they do, but in this case, there wasn't a market for that material. You can see the amount of slash that can pose a fuel hazard for future restoration efforts. And so to address this, we did some post-fire site prep, where we leveraged the funds that we had received through the salvage sales to to leverage those into site prep to deal with the development of fuel profiles. So this idea of sort of leveraging the value we had and putting that back into the landscape and trying to do ecologically appropriate restoration where we're mitigating these hazardous fuel accumulations. And so that material was all felled, it was piled with an excavator, and those piles were burned to prepare the site for planting. But you can see this is a photo a few years later. There are trees in that brush field. Please rest assured. However, you can see that there is just a very vigorous response in the shrub understory, as well as you can see there's some resprouting black oaks here that we wanted to maintain on the site. However, we have this pretty homogeneous cover of shrubs that have occupied the site and are competing with some of the trees and our objectives to reestablish forested conditions. So as you sort of plan your post-fire restoration strategy, I really want you to think hard about what those tactics will be to manage some of that understory or competing vegetation. This was a photo from the day we planted that site. Actually, I'm bummed I didn't include a photo of when we planted. But this is just showing you our little tree seedling, our little Styro 10D seedling stock that we were planting with a little plug of roots and soil. And even though the shrubs at that time didn't look, very, very dangerous or competitive from what they were expressing in their above ground biomass, you can see just simply from the size of the taproots and the extent of the taproots, how effective these small shrubs are in terms of competition with any seedlings you might establish. All right. And so not only are we talking about fuel profiles, but we're also talking about managing the competitive ability of these forested or these seedlings that were planted to compete for water and to actually thrive and grow. And this is really important when we think about this development of fuel profiles. And this is why. So this is a study from the Forest Service where they looked at tree height on the y-axis and year or time on the x-axis. And you can see that trees growing under heavy brush really only grew after 25 years to about 7 feet on average. Trees that likewise didn't compete with brush actually were maximized and grew to almost 25 feet in those years. So there's over a 15-foot height differential over those 25 years. And this is why it's important. Because we now need to think about what is the probability that site may reburn in the next 25 years. And when I showed you the example of the Story Fire, 2000 Story Fire reburned with high severity 12 years later in the Chips Fire. The Camp Fire was another reburn where that fire started in the 2018 Camp Fire started within the footprint of the 2008 BTU complex. The Dixie Fire reburned a number of fires, the Moonlight Fire, which was only an 11-year-old fire. And so we are seeing this reburn cycle happen within this 25 years of growth. And on the Moonlight Fire, this was about a 25-year-old tree seedling or seedling that was planted in a plantation. It was about 6 feet tall, about my height. And you can see it was swimming in a sea of brush And because we had neglected the growth requirements of those seedlings that we planted, they weren't tall enough or large enough to develop the fire resistant qualities that these species need to develop to be resistant to fire. So I don't want to paint one picture one way or the other, however. Here is a well, this is a plantation where they salvaged, they sprayed herbicide, they eliminated the shrub cover, they eliminated a lot of large wood and that fuel profile. But we're also starting to see, you know, I just want to be very like forthright that in all of, as in most of natural resources, it depends. And that is not a foolproof method for fireproofing our plantations, all right? And so here is an example of that, where you had a very young, small plantation. This is actually, Danny, I think this is between you and I think this is the whaleback fire that was planted as a high density plantation and had an understory of cheatgrass. And when the fire burned, it resulted in near 100% mortality of those planted seedlings. And you can see this landowner has come back and replanted again. So I commend them for their tenacity towards and dedication towards trying to get reestablished forested conditions. So I want to sort of emphasize that there are more than just two paradigms to restoration. I sort of presented you, and these are some photos of what we affectionately or not so affectionately call the wall of shame on the Moonlight Fire. On the left side of the road is private industrial forestry, where they have, you know, done salvage logging, applied herbicides, and planted trees, and been very successful in growing and establishing forested conditions, which is really, you know, an important objective. On the right side is public lands, unsalvaged, sort of unmanaged, and you can see sort of the resulting sort of snag forest with shrub complex. And the unfortunate, brutal reality is that these early seral stage forests, whether you're on the left side of the road or the right side of the road, are simply vulnerable to high severity fire and reburns, okay? And so I would, however, proffer that we shouldn't let post-fire restoration be characterized only by shades of black and white, because I do see that there is this huge sort of creative palette or shades of gray that can be created within these two paradigms. And so in this case, I'm sort of promoting this case for promoting heterogeneity at multiple scales. And here are some journal articles about reburn severity, both in managed and unmanaged vegetation, and sort of some of those issues that we're wrestling with, but also some papers and some science out there that are arguing that if we create more fine scale or heterogeneity at multiple scales, both at the fine scale, but also at the inter and intra-stand scales, that might help build some resistance and resilience to both fire and perhaps drought or other disturbances in this coming century. Because when you look at this landscape, either side of the road has a certain level of homogeneity, right? Whether it's green homogeneity or snag and dead tree homogeneity, they both represent a connectivity of fuel that lends itself potentially vulnerable to reburn. So here I'm going to offer an example of some maybe, I don't want to say out of the box thinking, because I think so often people are so quick to say, oh, we need to think out of the box. And I don't want to rationalize or justify, spaghetti on the wall or throwing darts, sort of like creative decision making. What I'm advocating here is for understanding conventional wisdom and applying experimental innovation in very calculated and measured ways, okay? So this is not just a free-for-all here. This is an example from the 2006 Boulder fire. Actually, Danny helped me with my tree mortality prescriptions on this. And we decided that we wanted to leave some strategically relevant and ecologically relevant amounts of snags on the site. But we also knew that snags would be a danger to both the public and our forest operations as we wanted to reforest this site. And so here is a slide from 10 years after. So you can see, afterward, it looks pretty bare. And we salvaged right up to the lake, which made some people nervous. But I think the slide on the right sort of shows the potential for recovery in ecologically relevant ways. In this case, we applied what we called a wide space cluster planting approach to try to establish forest conditions, but also promote heterogeneity at a fine scale. I have, there's a link to a paper that we published in 2019 on some of these concepts. And I'll give you a quick rundown. We see an opportunity to diversify reforestation tactics primarily in two main ways, as manipulating planting density, but also manipulating planting arrangement. Here's an example, just a very hypothetical example, where you have very conventionally spaced square space trees that you have planted. In this example to the right, we planted little clusters of 3 trees and spaced them widely. And we applied 50% mortality simply by rolling the dice for each tree and saying, did it live or did it die? And you can see that they express themselves in different modes or opportunities for heterogeneity and diversity when you put in some mortality. I think there's some promise here, and there's some additional factors that people can diversify, both in terms of density, species, seed lots, and elevations and seed zones. I want to thank a forester, Catherine Bennett from Forest Corps. She wanted to sort of implement one of these more clustered prescriptions on a small landowner. That small landowner who you saw in the first slide was interested in implementing some of these concepts. And so we came up with this sort of new example, which I sort of like, is implementing a cluster of trees and spacing it widely with some singular trees that we planted and alternating those to further sort of promote a pattern of that might enhance heterogeneity over time. This is an overhead drone shot of that plantation out at the Boulder fire on Antelope Lake. You can see we have some evenly spaced trees, some clusters of trees, some larger openings. You can see we have some retained snags that at this point, many of them started to fall and be part of our large down woody debris recruitment goals as part of our prescription. And you can also see that we left some wet areas with some clusters of snags that were a little bit denser for different wildlife habitat needs. As we've discussed earlier, there is just this huge need, and in fact, high severity fires happening on this landscape in scales that are far greater than how we are responding to it in terms of reforestation. And so in some cases, people aren't getting to restore these forests right after the fire. They're waiting 10 years before they can get in and actually do something meaningful. This is an example on the Moonlight Fire where we went into some of these snag fields that were reminiscent of that right side of the road in my past slides. And we went in with excavators and knocked down snags and ripped up brush and piled them to burn. And you can see we retained some ecologically appropriate levels of snags, but we also wanted to create some areas where we could establish forested conditions. During this, we did a study that I've linked to the bottom here that we just published in the International Journal of Wildland Fire, where we actually measured the fuel load before treatment and after treatment. And this is what we found. Before treatment, these landscapes had 60 tons of fuel per acre plus. You know, that was just of what was on the ground. It didn't include everything that would be recruited onto the ground through snagfall. So these post-fire environments are riddled with fuels. 10 years after, this material starts to deteriorate and it becomes very hard to handle. And so while we were able to meaningfully alter fuel loads, we found that we were really only able to cut the fuel load in about half. Whereas, just to put this into perspective, for these systems, a fuel load of 5 to 10 acres is really what's desired. And so we're looking at a magnitude of 6 to 12 times more fuel than we would desire out there for our restoration conditions. But this did allow us an ability to establish some forested conditions, retaining some ecologically appropriate levels of large down woody debris. We planted some trees both in clusters and in square spaces. We retained some snags for wildlife habitat, but cleared out a lot to provide for more safety for workers, as well as our mechanical treatment allowed us to use a more judicious application of herbicide around in the vicinity of the trees that we were planting, so we could improve their growth and maximize their growth and development of fire resistant qualities, but also maintain some levels of shrub and forbs on site to meet our ecological goals. And so this is that one of those plantations that I showed you that was impacted by some high severity fire. And you might ask why I am smiling in this photo. And this is the reason why. That's the other side of the photo where part of our cluster plantation did exhibit some resistance and resilience to wildfire. While the plantation burned and we lost trees, we still have a lot of trees out there that were only partially scorched or have enough green crown to hopefully retain forested conditions on the site. But as you can see, so much of this is dependent on how we treat the dead trees or the damaged trees after a wildfire. And that's, I sort of want to bring it back full circle to why these post-fire mortality guidelines are so important to your post-fire restoration planning. And they have a huge effect on how you meet your restoration goals, 10, 20 years down the line. Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention this evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. So we do have time for just a couple of questions that were posted. So Ben writes, in the high severity fires, such as the extremely hot zones at the center of the Collar fire, what are the chances for natural forest restoration, or will intensive human intervention be required to get those areas restored?
Oh, Ben, that's a good question. And there are a lot of people that are doing good science on this issue. I know that, in 2013, Brandon Collins and Gary Roller did a great paper that we steered them towards some older fires and asked them to wade through the brush and look for species that we hoped were regenerating. And they found that as these patches are getting larger and larger in size, the ability for these forests to regenerate naturally in these large areas are far reduced. And so that is going to be a huge legacy and issue that we're handing the next generation of forest managers if we don't act to sort of intervene in some of these systems where we think we can help meet our restoration goals faster through artificial regeneration. And so there's obviously, that sort of answer of it depends. It depends on your goals, your objectives, how long you're willing to wait for a forest to regenerate naturally. If you're willing to roll the dice, if you will, and see how those landscapes reburn, or if they reburn, we are finding that in these reburns, it's not only killing the regeneration, the small seedlings that are regenerating, but it's also gaining enough steam and heat to kill sort of the further erode at the small islands of green forest that were left behind on the first fire. And so that's particularly concerning, I think, for not only as foresters, but as a state with both climate goals and carbon goals. These are really important issues. So I would say that it's likely that in some cases human intervention will be required. But again, depends on your objectives.
Oh, it depends. Always depends. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now. Thank you all very much. Let's see.